guess what came before use effect. We're going to be learning class components and learning this whole way of managing state that is kind of came before any of this stuff with hooks. So when I first learned React, there was no such thing as hooks, and there was kind of just the class component way of doing things. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Yeah, keep them coming. I can always come back to this. But let's jump in here. So I'll share these lecture notes as well. This is coming out to Slack. And you have the starter for the guided project. That link is from my sandbox. I'll be updating that as we go. But I definitely recommend for all these guided projects, as much as you possibly can, just like fork this to your own and really follow along. And if I'm ever going too fast, which I probably will, just like shout out and let me know, or let your TLs know if you're shy, because it's really important, I think, even with some of this syntax stuff, even if you're kind of just following along and going through the motions of typing it out and you're not totally getting all of it, it's like muscle memory, just getting comfortable with even the little things of like which brackets I use here and kind of building the structure of these components, especially because class components are new. And we're going to be doing some more complex stuff later on. Just make sure you're following along and forking this to your own sandbox. Definitely recommend that. So in these lecture notes, I'll zoom in a little bit. So I added an objective here. We're going to be going through all these today. So we're really here to talk about class components and what they are. And I'm going to be focusing a lot on just the parallels between function components and how you've learned stuff so far and how we do those same things with class components. So over the next couple of lectures, you're going to see a bunch of refactoring and just working with apps that have a mix of class components and function components. And at first, you're probably going to find this really annoying. And I know a lot of students tend to think like, I just like function components. I don't really want to learn this other way. But of course, I think you already know the answer, and the reason why we do it is because when you jump in on a project, most companies that have React code bases have had them for, I guess, more than 2 years. So there's almost always in my experience, going to be a mix of function components and class components. So being able to jump smoothly between the two is going to help you out a lot. And that's really why we spend some time on this in the Lambda curriculum. So there's that aspect. We're going to be talking about how in class components world, we share data between components with state and props. We're going to see how that kind of is similar and different. And we're going to talk a lot about events, especially in the lecture today. And there's some really good info. Hopefully y'all had the time to go through it in the training kit. And I'll go through it a little more, but it's not a ton of depth in what we're doing today. There's like some extra stuff that's just like really here that I recommend checking out around the synthetic events. So we'll go through that later on. But I think in a bunch of the lectures coming up, we're going to be handling forms and click handlers and all that. And it's kind of just like a side item it's like a way to even introduce new concepts. It's not always the focus. So getting really comfortable with forms and handling events is just gonna really pay dividends for y'all. So then this is one that I added. We're gonna be thinking today about different levels of state in an application. So even in the simple kind of shopping list that we're going to be working on today, you're going to see that there are situations where we have state, for example, like a form that is, we just have those fields and that just needs to be like on that component. Then there's also a notion of state that is shared between multiple components. It's kind of just there for your whole application. In this example, it's just going to be like the grocery list. It's a pretty simple example, but starting to think about this idea of where state lives, whether it's living on this kind of child component or it's higher up in your tree, and kind of getting a visual idea of that in your mind is going to be really helpful. That's something that a lot of people get confused, like 2 weeks down the road when we're getting into Redux, things get a little tricky. So really just starting to think about that today, we'll kind of hammer that in a little bit. It's going to be helpful to start thinking about. So let me just pause this in Slido. Cool. Well, I'm actually in the lecture notes. I share a lot of links, and I'll probably keep adding more. So hopefully I can help with that. Spread operator, we're going to go over that a lot. That's good to know. Okay, cool. Thanks for the answers, y'all. And please don't be shy. The more y'all can jump in. Just want to encourage y'all to ask a lot of questions. Slido's now open for questions. We're just going to go in. I'll just go into this like a few times a lecture. But in addition to this, I also really welcome questions just as we go. So, you know, if you have even like a comment or just something you're thinking about, feel free to just drop it in Slack. I really like this to be more of a conversation than me talking at you all the whole time. So don't be shy and feel free to ask any questions just along the way as well. So we'll open up the guided project in a sec, but let's just look at the basics real quick. So I guess, has anyone seen class components before, or is this going to be kind of the first time? You've probably looked at them, but I think today is going to be the first time you really have to work with them. So this is just like the basic template of a class component. A little different than a function component, obviously. But basically, the big difference you're going to notice, and I know Dustin had the thing about CCR, which is cool. The big thing that I would really just remind yourself of is that you have to call render. So if you have a function component, you just have a return statement. And that's just going to be kind of built in. But here we have to wrap that return statement in this render class method. So this comes from like a more of a object-oriented style of programming that has been historically more popular than it is right now. When I was starting my career, a lot of things were really built around this kind of object-oriented way of doing things. It comes from, you know, lower level languages, C++ and stuff like that, and Ruby and Python make a lot of use of it. But JavaScript is kind of this mix of things where you can do things that way, but you don't really have to. Does anyone want to say in Slack, do you know, would you say is JavaScript a object-oriented language, or like what kind of programming language is JavaScript? You know, let's jump into Slack. Bit of a trick question. There's really a lot of right answers and almost no wrong answers here. So go for it. Okay, so yeah, mix of object-oriented and functional. Yeah, this thing is, I mean, pretty much anything you answer is going to be right because it can be object-oriented. The thing is, JavaScript's a little weird, and we're not going to get too deep into this. So if this feels like confusing, don't worry about it. It's just interesting to know. As you start learning more languages, you'll get curious about this if it's not like a curiosity already. But JavaScript has this weird kind of inheritance where we actually create prototypes and inherit from that. Rather than like a true project or object-oriented language, we actually write like constructor functions, and we have like a true notion of a class. In JavaScript, we have ES6, just from 2015. It kind of modernized the language, and we now have these really pretty, it looks more like Ruby code or something like that now, where we have like a class, and we have these arrow functions and all this nice stuff. But really, and let's focus on this for a second. So this is just like creating a little basic class. So if we were to define like a person that, say they just have a favorite genre of music, right? Like something super basic, we can create that with an ES6 class. And you've learned how to do this. I think that you may have learned this way in one of your earlier units too. Let me know if not, and we can do a little more review on this too. But I think this is just a review so far. But basically the idea here is that if we look at this class, this idea that we're like defining a class and then we can instantiate that class, what's actually happening under the covers in JavaScript is that we're creating a function. And like Bruno said, everything is an object. Like even a function is an object. And we're basically just creating this object that has a prototype. Like every object has a prototype. Think of it as just like the mold that it's created from, right? So I'm writing a function that creates this object, right? And it's just defining it to that object with this. So you can literally think of the constructor as just a function that creates an object, right? And then we're going to the prototype to define that that objects of this class, it's not really a class, but objects of that type, right, would have this listen function. So again, don't worry about the details of this too much, but it's interesting to notice that just with how JavaScript works, like there's this very kind of simple architecture where everything's an object, and we're pretty much just, our constructors are just creating type of object. And when we're writing ES6 classes, this is really all that's happening under the surface. So good to know if you're curious about that. We kind of made this point already. You're gonna need a mix of everything. And if you want some more practice after class, there's a few interesting links that I included here. Yeah, that's right. A standard JS object is actually just a data type. A class object more closely resembles an object. Well, kind of, yes. Although I guess the only caveat there is that there's not actually any functional difference in the code. There's actually, like, these are identical. The only difference that happens that we might cover today is it comes down to binding. And if you're writing like class methods, like when we go to write these lifecycle methods, you end up getting some automatic binding with arrow functions that is different from the old school JavaScript way. But anyway, that's getting a little bit into the weeds. So let's jump into some code. Let me know if anyone needs the link again. I think you should have it already. But what we're going to be working on today is just this basic shopping list app. And the project you're going to be doing, I guess tomorrow, is very similar to this. It's like a to-do app. So this is going to be good practice to just kind of learn the patterns, learn the event handlers and all that. And then you're going to be applying the same ideas to your to-do app. But basically what we have here is we just have like a pretty basic setup where the UI is built for us, which is nice. But wait, I'll get my vertical. Normally it's open the other way. Well, whatever. So we have like the UI built, but nothing is really hooked up yet. So if we look at what's happening, we have just like in our index.js, this is the top level of our app. And I'll probably mention this many times again, but one thing to know is if you're ever confused with multiple files and you're just wondering like, where's the root of the app? Like if I were visualizing my tree of like, you know, here's the top level component, and then I'm going to build a tree of my other components. The top level is always where we have this React DOM render call. And sometimes we're going to have like a React router up there and different ways of doing this. But in general, especially in these guided projects for what we're doing here, it's always going to be something pretty similar to this. So that's a good clue to know. This is like the top of your tree. Sometimes it's going to be index.js, sometimes an app.js, but this is kind of where everything starts. So here we're defining an app component, which is just kind of the base level of our application. And you notice there's some hard-coded data here. So these groceries are, this is just like kind of a predefined shopping list. And this is simulating if you had an app where, say, you've logged in and you're going to hit an API, and like knowing that it's my account, the API returns this information of this list of groceries, right? And so this comes back, but we're just simulating that for now with just an array. So we have this array of data, and it's kind of just coming in. If we see what's happening, our render, we're creating a grocery list component and passing that data down. There's no notion of state here yet. Like this is kind of, you might say this is like an uncontrolled component. I know the comments on one of the other components say that. There's basically no state going on here. We just have you can think of this as a prop, but it's not even really a prop. It's like a global variable that's defined here that we're just grabbing, and we're going to pass it down. So now this comes in to grocery list as a prop. So in grocery list, now we're able to kind of render, and we just have a map here. And can anyone tell me what a map does? Quick review on arrays. I'll be asking kind of rapid fire questions like this in Slack. So map is it's just like a standard method on the array in JavaScript. Yeah. iterates, yeah, iterates over the array. It's basically gonna do something for each. I would think of it as a for each loop and then return a new array. It's gonna like build one of these for each item in that array. So basically we're rendering an item component for each grocery in that array, right? Yeah, that's exactly right. Thanks, y'all. So basically we're just iterating through that array and we're going to create an item for each one. And it's all pretty straightforward. Let's take a look at item real quick and see what's going on here. And I'm going through this pretty slow, but it's nice to have a good idea of the code base. When I'm new on a project, I really like to take my time and get to know kind of what's going on. Because I think a lot of, when I get confused, a lot of it comes from just like diving in too fast and not really knowing the architecture super well, not knowing what pieces are doing what. So it's really nice to know, especially like if I was just jumping an app like this and I had to work on this, one of the first questions I would ask is like, which part of the UI corresponds to which component? You know what I mean? So like, if I were to think of this visually, like this little bit, this like where it says bananas, that box, that's a single item component. Whereas the, this whole like unit, and I believe it includes the clear purchase button, this whole unit, this like area of the UI is going to be our grocery list component. And then we have a list form, which is where we would add a component. And there's some stuff here that is not really implemented at all yet. That we'll do that in the second half of the lecture today. But this is the basic idea. So we're kind of set up, and I guess the first thing we're going to want to do is to kind of just set up a notion of state. So I know you're new to class components, and we're going to go through this really slowly, but as far as just conceptually, my question for y'all is what's like the first thing I want to do? How do I make this like an application that has state? Like what I want to do with these groceries to actually make this application useful. As of now, we're kind of just passing down hard-coded data and we can't really do anything with it. So like when we think of what a constructor might do and how we might start to create an application with state, what would be the first thing we'd want to do, in Slack? Yeah, super. That's going to be part of it. This is where it gets interesting. We actually can't use state in a class component, but that's exactly right for function components. So what we're going to be doing right now is actually the equivalent of use state, but for these class components. It's going to do the same thing, just slightly different syntax. And while you're thinking about it, let's go over here too and kind of think about this for a little bit. So this is like our template here. We create a constructor function. Let me know if there are any questions on just the just kind of the basics here too. I know this is new and y'all haven't had a lot of experience with object-oriented programming before, so I don't expect this to be, just like obvious how this all works. It's a bit of an abstract concept, this idea. It's often taught, I think you did it in one of the earlier units, like people always teach it with like, all right, we're gonna make a dog class and the dog can bark, and we create classes like that. But it's like a bit of an abstract computer science concept that might not be the most immediate thing for everyone. So if that feels a little confusing, it's totally fine. So let's see, this dot state. Yeah, Sean nailed it. That's awesome. This dot state. So yeah, we want to basically initialize state. We want to say that state is basically want to create something that has state rather than what we have right now. It's just kind of nothing. So let's start. So we're creating a constructor, and can anyone tell me why I wrote it like that? Why I'm not like defining a new arrow function here? Because if I think of, and it's the same for render. Like if I were to write a new function here, I might just write an arrow function. But for these, I'm actually doing something a little different. I'm saying constructor. Does anyone know why that is? Yeah, calling it's predefined. That's exactly right. So we're basically, this is something like if we think back to those prototypes, it's like when I defined that prototype listen function. This is the vanilla JavaScript way. This is the old school. Just like this, with an arrow function. It's picture if I had written this person class, and then I'm now going to say like a musician class or some like professional athlete class or something. And I'm now going to like extend the functionality, but I'm going to invoke this kind of base method. So that's also what happens when we notice we call class app extends react.component. This is pretty different than what we're doing with function components, where we just have like, here's a function. You know, it's much simpler, and most people prefer function components for a lot of reasons. But this is kind of like how React started, and there's some really good things about it. It's a bit more like predefined for you. You have to kind of do a little bit less. That's like defining your own everything, and it's kind of like, all right, we already have a constructor, we already have a render method. The lifecycle methods kind of work in a certain way that are really, it's kind of just like some predefined logic. You get a lot already just by doing this extends. Whereas when you're using function components, it's a bit more like you got to roll your own for everything. So let's see, we have Supreme, Asha, a bunch of people pointed out we want to call super. Can anyone tell me what that does? I know it's a bit of a loaded question, but based on reading the training kit, what does that super call do? Why am I calling that? It's kind of like the default, like whenever I think to write a constructor, I'm just going to call super, done. But I guess what exactly happens there? Yeah, so it pulls in everything that the class is extending off of. That's exactly right. I guess I'm curious specifically what that might be. The big thing is props. It's going to initialize props and just pass those down. So if you think of what I was doing in that kind of dumb example in the lecture notes, I'm passing a couple props into a class, and I'm going to define them to this component, right? It's part of like the instantiation process there, if you think of it that way. Yeah, so that's great, Sean. It brings in the properties and methods of the class. So that is kind of just giving us this baseline. It does actually a lot of stuff. So I would always recommend just like I just did. I kind of just like Googled this and found the React docs. There's other articles you might find if you start Googling stuff like that. That's usually what I do if I'm curious about this stuff. But it initializes that local state, and well, I guess that's kind of what we do with it, right? But it's saying you call super props because it's going to pass those down. Otherwise, this.props is going to be undefined, and that's kind of basically how we set things up, because we want to access the props that are passed into a component. That's obviously an important thing. So that's going to initialize everything and get our prop set up. And then now, I think a couple of people already said it, we're going to want to define this.state. And notice that we're using this here. This is going to be kind of the big difference between function components and class components, is that instead of something like use state, where we're kind of defining state as just like we might have a state object called groceries. Instead of doing that, this is where actually there's only one state object per class, and it's called state. So this.state is going to include like multiple objects that are, whatever we need. But it's a bit of a different hierarchy. It's always going to be wrapped in this .state rather than being like standalone little objects, right? So we're going to say this.state is an object that includes groceries. That should be it. Does anyone know the shorthand for this? If I want to clean up this line, there's a nice little ES6 trick that we teach sometimes. Well, I'll just tell you. So doing that is actually the same as this, just shorthand. So that's just a shorthand because, as you start passing down props and stuff, you're going to find, you've probably already found in the projects you've done so far, that you're often just kind of passing stuff down the chain that has the same name. So this is just like an easy way of kind of defining this and saying like, all right, we have a field called groceries, and we're just passing in groceries. And we'll be doing it on the other level as a prop. So if we think of our architecture now, we have created a state, and when we pass this down, we actually want to not pass down this. Can anyone tell me what we now want to pass down to our grocery list? Instead of that hard coding, we want to actually have like our state data that we pass down now. That's right. Great, y'all. Y'all are fast. Okay. So now we're passing this down, and so we've now actually done quite a bit just with that. We now have an application where we can start to work with state. And all we have to do is actually start creating some methods that are going to do that. So I guess the first thing we want to do, the desired behavior for this app is to, like, I want to be able to click this. Let's see, I'm curious if it's already implemented in some form. No, not really. But basically the idea here is that we want to click this and have it toggle a class. We want to actually not only toggle a class, but actually change it in state. So we want to have a notion of like, I'm looking at my shopping list, I'm going to click this and then say like, okay, I've now purchased bananas, gray out that item and just reflect that change in state, right? You can kind of see what the intended behavior is here. There's a bit of reverse engineering here. We can see, what's our item class? So yeah, item. So this is kind of our CSS for how this looks. And then you notice item.purchased is going to have just like a more pale, a nice little faded salmon J.Crew kind of color here. So yeah, so that's basically what we're trying to do. And I think there's a strike through too. Yeah, exactly, line through. So it's kind of like, you know, you might, if you're working on a team, you might actually end up working on an app like this where someone has already done a bit of the design work. You might end up writing some of the CSS yourself, but you'd be, like in the project I'm doing right now, I'm just kind of, sometimes I just have CSS that I can kind of copy in that's ready to go. And my job is more to like build the logic around it. So this is a common thing that you'll encounter. So basically what we want to do, we want to think about being able to click this item and have it toggle some notion of like whether it's purchased or not. I believe it's already defined up here. Yeah, see we have purchased false. So these all come in as purchased false, but we want to be able to obviously change that. So I'm going to start this for you before I ask any questions, but basically we're going to think of just building something that is going to toggle that field. So we can call this like toggle item. We can call it toggle purchase or something, but up to you what you want to call it. And let me know if anyone, I think I'm saving this already. We haven't done that much yet, but let me know if anyone needs anything to be able to follow along. So we're going to pass in an item ID, and we're going to use that item ID here to be able to toggle that. So we're thinking of, this is basically going to be coming up from the item element. We want to be able to, within the item component, somehow trigger this function. So that's going to be the kind of challenging thing today, and kind of what I mentioned about this component and app level state here. We have state that is on our app component, but we want our item component to be able to change that state. I don't know if that doesn't make sense. I know this is like a bit tricky to wrap your head around at first, but the idea is that there's these different levels of state here, and what we're actually managing on the app component is like very in a direct way application level state. It's literally our app component, right? So like the entire app as we know it is managing these groceries, whereas the concerns of like the item component is more just that one little piece of the UI. But still within this component, we're going to want to be able to, like, this is where we define that div. We want to know that when I click on that div, something's going to happen, not just within this component, but actually at the top level, right? So we're going to somehow pass up this item ID. We'll figure out how to do that after. And I'll just make like a little kind of placeholder function here. Often what I'll do while I'm figuring something out is I'll just kind of build like the template of a function here. This is going to be like a method on this class. And again, notice that this is actually now a new function. So we're calling an arrow function here rather than this more, this kind of like extending something that was there, right? So here, let's think about what we actually want this to do. So we're going to have to, first of all, we're going to have to like find the right item in the grocery. So like knowing the item that was clicked, we're going to need to be able to figure that out. And then we're also going to, I guess, find the item that was clicked. There it is. Right, so we're going to find that actually reflecting like something that came up from a click in our notion of state here. And so when we find it, right, so since we're working at this level, we have to do that first step of like finding the item, and then we toggle the purchase field. And I guess we're going to return. We don't want to change the other items. So I know y'all asked about the spread operator, and that's going to be kind of what we get into. That becomes increasingly important with Redux and all that in a couple of weeks. So it's really going to get it solid on that idea that every time we change state, we're creating a new object. And the spread operator allows us to kind of just like take what we had before and open it up, like spread it out into a new object. So then we can just change one little thing, right? Rather than, you know, it might be intuitive to think like, we just want to say like, you know, this dot state dot groceries, you know, like if we're just change it like that. But we don't ever do that because that creates a bunch of problems when we start having more complex state management and a bunch of state transitions happening. You're thinking like a big React app, you might have thousands of state transitions happening every second. So we want to get really orderly about how we manage state. And that's kind of what we get into in the next unit. So for now, this is kind of just the basic template here. And let's think what we want to do next. We can start building this out, I think. So we basically just want to build that function, and then we want to figure out how we would actually handle that at the lower level. So let's build this first. But I guess before we do that, does anyone have an idea of how we might handle this kind of architecture, this relationship between like we have our app component, obviously grocery list, and then all the way down to item? Like how would we allow, like we're gonna have a click handler here. How would I set it up so that when I click something there, it's going to impact the app component? Does anyone know how to do that already? That's really, there's a few things to focus on today, but I think that's, as far as like where we're headed in this unit, that's going to be like the biggest concept to really get solid on. Yeah, that's right, props. We want to actually pass that down. You may have heard the term prop drilling before. And we're basically going to be taking that toggle item function, and we're going to pass it all the way down through the levels so that item can call it. And the point that I want to make really clear is that when we are calling that toggle item class, even though it's going to be happening from the item component, the state that we're affecting is actually at the top application level. So there's a sense of interaction between the components here, where the individual components can have their own state, but in the case of actually changing this, we want to pass it all the way up to the application level state. So let's go ahead and build this right now. This is a nice easy one to knock out, and then we can take a break and plug everything in. So I'll just leave this pseudocode here. I really recommend this method if you're ever getting a little overwhelmed by something. Just build like the shell of your function and literally write out like a comment that doesn't even have to be pseudocode. Just write like in plain English what you're trying to do. And then we'll just do this step by step. It makes it feel a lot, at least for me, it makes it feel a little more like I know what I'm doing and I don't get caught in the weeds as much. So let's see. First thing I'm gonna wanna do is be more useful when we actually plug this in. I like to console log out what's coming in. So that's a really easy way to debug if something's gonna be kind of funky, to be able to kind of know what's happening. So actually, change my mind, why don't we just do it this way first? We can hook it up and then build this after break, because this is gonna be a little more visual to actually see what's happening. So I would say let's pass this down as a prop. Does anyone tell me how I would do that? Like if I want to pass this toggle item, this actual function down as a prop, like how am I going to get it to item? Y'all are looking at these layers here. So if we think of the tree, we have our app, and then we have grocery list, and then we have item would be like the bottom level of the hierarchy. So I'm going to want to pass this through directly. Yeah, that's awesome, Jason. So we're going to do that. We actually have to do that in a couple different places. So if you notice this grocery list, we're passing groceries already, but we also now want to, let me just open this up. We're just going to add like another prop here where toggle item is this dot hub. Okay, so we just passed that all the way through. So now if I go into grocery list, from this level, I know that I noticed that this is actually a function component. I didn't mention that before. But this grocery list is not a class component. It's just taking in props. And at this level, we're going to have like whatever was passed in as a prop, we're going to have access to on props, right? Just like we're saying props.groceries. So at this level, notice that we're rendering an item. Can anyone tell me now how do I pass it from this level to item? This is kind of the slightly trickier part because we're like bouncing back and forth between class components and function components. So I want to be able to say, yeah, that's awesome. Thanks, Terry. So we're just going to pass this straight down. So now, just like to get this hooked up fully before break. So we have one more step, which is within item now. We want to actually create some kind of click handler. So let's see what that might look like. We want just like this div itself. I'm going to open this up as well so we can see it. You're always welcome to just kind of make things multiple lines to make it more readable. Style thing. Yeah, nice, Doug. I didn't even ask the question yet. That's awesome. I love that. So on click is toggle item. Yep. So yeah, hopefully this is all making sense so far. I will pause for questions in a sec because I know this is quite a bit already. You're always welcome, like I said, to just shout out questions along the way too, in addition to the actual slide elements. Don't mind. So we're going to create like a function here. It's going to be an arrow function. And what we're going to say, we have our, this is also a function component. So we're doing props. So props.toggle item. And last question, can anyone tell me what I'm going to actually pass into this? Because we need an argument here. We need to get our item ID. So, you know, got some clues here of where we might get this. And obviously, it's going to come from props because we're doing a function component here and there's no state on this component. So if we look at grocery list, we're passing down an item. not passing down the ID at sec. Oh, there's actually a key too. That's interesting. I didn't notice that. Actually, I want to try that. The way I normally do this is with the item dot. I normally do it like this. What was I? Yeah, so like props.item.id. But I'll try the key in a sec. That should work. So now with this built, I should be able to open up a console. Also, if anyone knows how to just like change this to a normal layout where the browser is on the right, that would be awesome. It's the first time I've had to open up like this. So I should be able to just click one of these now and see, I'm gonna see something come through in the console. Yeah, there we go. So the ID of each of these is gonna be coming back. Yeah, I'll check it over break. Thanks, Alex. This is a little hard to see with this layout. So yeah, hopefully that makes sense so far. We're clicking, I wrote a click handler in item that is actually kind of bubbling up the layers of the stack of the tree. It goes through grocery list and then back to our app component where we pass toggle item. And so far all this is doing is just console logging it out. But already that's pretty cool that we're able to kind of connect those layers. And the key idea to remember with this is that you just want to really be aware of which components have state and which don't. And also, like for example, when we build out this component, we're going to need state on that component to be able to know, like we want to be able to store what we type in there, right? But some of these simpler ones like item doesn't even have state. It's really just like a simple function component that is like in the true sense, because when people started writing function components, it was before hooks. And for a while, I think even if you click the link from the training kit, it's actually kind of funny. It's a comparison of class components and function components. And it says like, well, function components can't have state. And obviously now they can with hooks. But this was like the original way of doing function components, where it's really just like, it has kind of a simple task. But we're able to pass this down and we're calling this and it goes all the way back up. So all this works. I want to try this key and see if that also works. I'm just curious. Let's try this. Oh. What was that key? Are you using that somewhere? Oh, no. Yeah, I'm not quite sure what that's about, but don't worry about it. So this works. This is kind of a standard way of doing it. So let's go to questions and then take a quick break. Oh, and actually, while I'm taking these questions, let me also real quick, I'll start this poll here. So I'll give you all the choice. I have like a little Lambda playlist that I normally play, and I'll update it for y'all, or I can play something else. But just let me know if you want kind of normal like lo-fi stuff, instrumental hip hop, or I'm also really into like this kind of stuff. Surprise us. I know a lot of people like silence too, so it's pretty much just like consensus of what people want, and I will respond to that. Okay, so questions. Just do that while I'm going through these. So, oh yeah, I saw this before. In classes, do you still need to turn? Yeah, you do. It's wrapped normally in, we have a render method. And if you think of, it's like, I guess one way to visualize the difference between a function component and a class component is that it's almost like a function component would be if you just took this line and got rid of the rest. So like we just write a function and then we just return, you know. It's kind of like class components have all these extra layers. Like the return element, the return function isn't just like the return, it's actually the return of the render method, right? And we have the constructor and everything. But yeah, we're always going to need a return. It's just a matter of whether or not we're wrapping it in render. That's the way I would think about it. if you're trying to just remember the differences, there's a nice little breakdown here that we can talk through as well. But pretty much, I think I mentioned something like that. Maybe not. But that would be like, I think one of the main differences is just like rather than just having return, we're wrapping it in render for a class component. If that answers the question. The item ID, I think we probably already answered that. We passed it up from the lower levels, which is why I wanted to kind of like show the passing first. And then after the break, we'll just actually implement that array function. Music during break is sensory overload. That is fair. See what everyone else thinks. Can you save the code? Yes, I think I already did. But yeah, in general, I try to save pretty often. People like to go follow along that way. Yes, this is right. You can only return one item inside render. But that item could be an object. We set this dot state equals groceries, and then we pass this dot state dot groceries. Well, we pass that because if we think of like a bigger application, sometimes questions like this can get a little tricky just because we're working with such simple examples in these lectures. But if you think of a bigger application, sorry, zoom controls on the screen. There we go. If say we had groceries equals that, and then we also had like a bunch of other stuff. We could have like a bunch of variables here, and we don't want to pass all that down. We just specifically want to pass groceries. So that's why we said this dot state dot groceries. Otherwise, we might be passing down a bunch of variables. I think maybe at the core of this question is also just getting comfortable with the idea that in a class component, there's one state variable that includes everything. Whereas in function components, we're used to making like, we say use state, and we would just say like use state groceries, right? Instead of, and we might have one for each state variable we need. But in a class component, there's only one this dot state. This is an interesting question. We'll probably spend more time talking about this after lecture for anyone who wants to stay. It's a big question, but I would say, I guess my answer to that would be, don't get too caught up in specific ways of doing things or frameworks. So at the end of the day, like even what we're teaching you here is going to be obsolete in like 3 years. So all that matters is the concepts, and most importantly, being able to like Google and figure out new stuff quickly. That's really the skill set in my mind of a developer, specific to the work I do. It's really, I have to work in so many different languages and frameworks, and it's like I just try to be really agnostic about what I'm working in. And like I might have my own personal preferences, but at the end of the day, it's like I'm jumping on a project, and I enjoy projects that have a purpose to them. I do a lot of work in education and entertainment, stuff like that. So I tend to just take projects I like rather than worrying about like, maybe they're using some old framework or using class components instead of function components. But just knowing both and being comfortable with the switch, I think is like flexibility is key, would be my answer. You want to know both, but I guess at the end of the day, you're going to spend most of your time on new stuff, but just make sure you're learning the concepts rather than getting locked in your own framework. So with that, let's go to a 5-minute break. Thanks, y'all. All right, y'all, come on back. Hopefully everyone's feeling good about what we've covered so far. Well, I see Surprise Us and I see a lot of instrumental hip hop, so maybe we can check in a couple weeks, but I will build a playlist like that. And yeah, I always hear back from a few people that want just silence, but I guess if it's less than like, I don't know, 10% of the class, then we'll play tunes. So let's dive back in. I'll just pause this so you have the Q&A up. So diving right back in, the next move is to actually implement this toggle item. So just kind of reviewing what we've done so far. I know it's a little bit of conceptual stuff already. We are writing a function that is a class method here. And it's part of this app component, which is a class component. And we're passing it through what we see in the code here. And this is like if you were just to jump on this project and kind of figure out the architecture, you'd want to see, I'd also be looking like where's stuff getting passed down, what's passing what, we're going to look, we see here grocery list is passing. Like if I were kind of just seeing this app for the first time, I might see that toggle item function and I would be quick on my Command F, like, where's that going? What's happening with that? And I'd look like, in VS Code, you can do Command Shift F and look like in all the files, see where that's kind of showing up. I like to do that a lot as I'm just like kind of getting comfortable with the new architecture. So I'm gonna be looking in grocery list and seeing like, all right, now we have toggle item. In this case, it is props because we're in a function component. If we were in a class component, this would be this dot props, right? Just because we're in class, and this is basically like referencing back to the class. But so all we have to do now that this is coming into item, and to review also, we wrote this click handler. We can go through, we'll go through some more event handling, like the list form in a second. But this is a very simple example where we are just calling this click handler and it just calls this little function. Can anyone tell me in Slack, just kind of reviewing from the training kit, tell me about anything you know about the virtual events in React. So this is kind of built into the API in React. Let me know any like interesting stuff about them, or I guess especially differences between these virtual events and like the normal events in JavaScript. It's good to be kind of familiar with that. I know if you got a lot of time to go through the training kit, but you can let me know in Slack any of those things. You can also just go over it again if that's kind of feeling new. Let's do that. So we have like the virtual DOM in React, and I think everyone's pretty comfortable with kind of what the DOM is, this idea that we have a tree of all these elements that are kind of making up the web page. And in React, we basically simulate all that and create like a abstraction layer on top of the actual DOM. And we have these synthetic events that are going to be called, they get pooled and kind of handled in a certain way by React in the backend. But as far as we need to know, the difference is that instead of like a button on click with this string that's like, this is like kind of JavaScript, but it's in a string. In the JSX, we're actually, well, for one, we camel case it. It's like on click capitalized, right? Let me show it somewhere around here. Yeah, we're saying button on click with that capitalization, camel case. And we actually just, it's like we're directly writing JavaScript. It's a little cleaner than this idea of like in vanilla JavaScript, we are passing like a string that's telling what to do. Normally, if you're doing this in a non-React app, you're gonna not wanna do this inline most of the time. You're gonna do it with like in your actual JavaScript file rather than the HTML. With React, we're kind of like pooling the JavaScript and the HTML into this big kind of JSX mishmash of everything. So it's kind of cool the way it ends up working out, where we can just kind of call everything together. But that would be the differences if that ever comes up on an interview or something, if someone's asking you about the virtual DOM and virtual events. The difference is that in JSX, we are calling the code directly, and it's camel case instead of lowercase, like in JavaScript. So anyhow, what we want to do now that we've actually hooked everything up is we want to go back to the top level, and we're going to implement this. Oh, never took the second. I forgot. Let's see. I'll do next break. So now we want to actually implement this. So does anyone want to tell me what array method I might use to iterate through the array and figure out like which item that was? There's probably a couple right answers here. Yeah, you could do it with a filter too. I think, oh yeah, find. I think all these would work. Any other ideas, y'all? I think like the most straightforward way to do it is just going to be a map, but it's definitely a style thing of what you'd want to use. Filter you'd want to use more when you're really looking for like a specific one. Filter is a great choice for this button here, this clear, because filter is literally going to kind of in one step just return an array without that one. You can define that. So filter is kind of built for that functionality. Map is a little more just like general purpose, right? So let's just do it with map. It's very straightforward. We already kind of know how it works a little bit. So what we want to do is we're going to use a method. This is kind of all going to be together. I don't know if I'll break it up by lines. We're going to use this method called set state, and this is just like when we do like if we said like groceries, set groceries equals use state, right? This is going to be the equivalent of this from the hook side. Does that make sense? It's going to be a more general, just because we have this one, remember we only have one state variable in a class component. We have, instead of this like per variable, we're just going to have this dot set state. And this is another thing that's built in, like when we called super, we're instantiating all the basic stuff from React.component, this like parent class. So when we get all that, we get all these methods, and this is one of the methods we get. So we get set state, and this works just the same as hooks. The hooks are kind of based off of this. So it's not too different. So this will be pretty straightforward. So within this state, this dot set state, we're going to want to define, we're basically, and this is a good thing to remember, we're creating a new object every time. We're kind of enforcing this idea that the state data can't just be changed willy-nilly. You know, we're not just like going in and just changing something, and you know, different components change it whenever they feel like it, and things get all out of sync and weird, especially if you are dealing with APIs and all that. We want to create a new object that's very kind of orderly, and so we're gonna, this is setting state to what's in between these braces, which is literally a new object. So hopefully that makes sense. So within this new object, we're going to define what groceries is, right? So I'm just gonna like emphasize this point. This is one of the things that gets really tricky in the later part of this unit. So as much as we can kind of cover it a little bit early on, I think it's helpful. If it feels like I'm repeating the same thing over and over, then I'm sorry if it's annoying, but you might thank me later. Maybe. So groceries is going to be, we're going to create a new array here. So let's grab the previous one. We said we're going to use a map. So we have this.state.groceries. Okay. And can anyone tell me a little bit about what this syntax looks like? We just saw another example of map before. What kind of thing am I going to do here? It's just like the standard form of map. Yep, we're gonna have an arrow function per like each one. So we can call each one in here an item, an arrow function. And this is basically saying, and of course, here's our beautiful JavaScript nesting that I already told you I don't love, but that's part of what we got here. So we're gonna have this map, which takes an item and passes everything through. So within this map, for each item, we're gonna do some logic. And this is where, you might think of a few different ways to do this. My first thought would be to use just like a standard kind of if statement. And we're gonna, like you notice, we're gonna find the item that was clicked. So we might expand on that saying, looking for the item with item ID. So we're going to just create like a kind of if statement here where we're going to say if, you need to really write the pseudocode, it's pretty straight up. This if the item ID, which was passed in, that's what we console log, right? So if that equals this item dot ID, right? That's our conditional. So then we're going to want to toggle that purchase field. So hopefully that makes sense so far. So we're looking through, we're going to find that, one, and we're going to say, if that's the case, this return statement is within just this one step of the map, right? This isn't like a global return. We're gonna, this is where we're gonna use the spread operator to take what was in the item before and just toggle that purchase field. So this is kind of this is like the most crucial part of the implementation. Can anyone tell me what goes in here? I want to take, turn the item with the purchase field, right? So we're not going to change anything else. We're just going to change that. Does anyone know how to kind of build this? Big hint is that it involves a spread operator. Nobody? Okay, well this might be pretty new stuff. That's all good. But please ask questions if this is confusing. I'd love to know which part of this is tricky for y'all. So we're taking item. Remember, this is within one step of the map. We're going to return that item. Your instinct, again, might be to do something like, instead of all this, you might say like item.purchase equals or something like that. That's kind of what we don't want to do. Instead, we're building this whole new object each time. So by doing this, this is almost the same as if I had just said like, so here's kind of a review of the spread operator real quick. So if I were to say, item, that would be the equivalent of dropping in this. That is our full item, right? Okay, that's good to know, Misty. Yeah, so this is kind of like the key thing that gets really confusing, that honestly, like the reason Redux and other stuff gets so hard is because if these concepts aren't like super solid, then it's just like building levels on top of that. So definitely like ask a lot of questions and get really comfortable on this whole stuff with the spread operator, because it's like one of the key concepts to get solid on. So item, if we were to pass that in, is like this. That is the full item. Whereas spread is basically opening that up and it's grabbing the attributes of it. That makes sense? This is equivalent to that stuff. Just the stuff that was inside of the item. Whereas without the spread operator, it's like the whole item itself, which is an object. So key difference there is that spread operator takes the object, instead of returning the object itself, it's actually sending the attributes of it, right? So we want to open this up. This is creating a new item object with what was in there before, and then we're just flipping the purchase field. Tony, I hope that means that that makes sense. Not that it doesn't make sense. Let me know. I can always explain things a different way. Um, but yeah, that's exactly right. So we opened up item. And again, this is just grabbing what was inside of that item object. And when we do this, it's like overriding that field. Like, just one more time, this is literally as if I had done this. This is actually what's happening here. This might be the wrong item, but just in theory, right? If we're talking about granola, this is what we just did. We basically like copy pasted all this stuff in here, and we're defining purchase twice. We're like grabbing what it was before, and then we're overriding it, right? So that's kind of what's happening here. And please, any questions on that? I would love to review it, and we can also stay after class to kind of go through stuff a different way for anyone that would like. But yeah, anyhow, so that's kind of where we land here. And this is like we found the item. You can think of this as like the happy path. We found the item that we want. Sad path would be it's like not the right item, or maybe like we got an invalid ID and it's just like not even in the list, or we already deleted it, or something got weird with the data. In that case, we are just going to return item. We can put an else here, but it's not really necessary. So all this is doing is just toggling that field. Yeah, Misty, that's exactly right. This is called a bang operator. And it's for like a Boolean in JavaScript, because this purchase is, if we look up, we're looking at a false value. So it's just going to toggle that true false. And that's in like almost every programming language, pretty standard syntax for when we're toggling Booleans like that. That is it. Let's see. I think this is already going to work. Ooh, it's nice. Yeah, that's it. Pretty cool, right? So I know I went through that in excruciating detail, but trying to get at the points that are going to help you later on in this unit. Because, you know, a lot of Lambda students say that the Redux stuff, specifically in parts of this unit, are like the hardest part of the whole curriculum. So if my mission is one thing right now, it's to make it less hard later, if we can do some of that. So doing the best I can with that. So this is all. Oh, Bruno, yeah, that's what we would do like later on. But in a simple app like this, you're often going to find more of this kind of architecture. Oh, Alex, state.groceries has always been an array actually, because we just defined it as it's coming from right here, and you see this is an array. I know some people mentioned the brackets thing, and maybe just a good thing to just like review is that just always in JavaScript, our curly braces are going to mean an object. This is an object, and then the square braces are for an array. Obviously, they come up in other contexts that make things confusing, but just in general, like this groceries, like that is a array of objects, and you can tell by the square braces, and then within it, each of those is an object, right? Okay, so we've implemented the core of this, and I'm going to pause for questions, and then we will build out the add field, and then if there's time, we can do clear purchase too, but that's kind of a bonus. So yeah, so the add thing is mainly what we want to do with the rest of today. So let's see what questions y'all have. Still unsure as to how the item is being toggled. If you want to elaborate, that would be great. So I know I already kind of hit this for a bit, but it really has to do with that spread operator. If there's any specific questions on the spread operator, that would be a great thing to maybe review a bit after class today. I can stick around for a bit. But really getting comfortable with just how we're grabbing those attributes and then we're overriding with that bang operator. That's kind of what's happening. So on Next.js with the item, how do we know what item you're grabbing? Oh, good question. It's coming from this if statement, right? So the map is saying we're going through an array, and it's basically saying like, all right, let's check bananas. Is the ID of bananas the one that was sent through? Nope. Milk? Nope. Raw honey? Nope. Oh, it's tortillas. The ID matches, and then it goes into here. Otherwise, it's just returning it unchanged. So that item, we know we're only going to get into this path if that item ID matches. And I'm just going to keep the console log in there. If this was like production code, obviously we would take that out. But seeing that come through is a helpful thing. And you could even, like, say you were building this and things were kind of getting gnarly and it wasn't really working out for you. You could actually break this out into something where you might say like new item equals, like, define the object here and then return like the new item. And then you could kind of console log this out. Let's see, item, then we could console log this. You know, you could break down each step of this process and just console log that stuff out and just get really annoying with it. Oh, I broke something, of course. Oh, no, it's there. Yeah, so you can console log that out and like notice how it made purchase true. So if things are ever getting weird and something just not working right, like if we'd implemented that and then this stuff is just like, oh yeah, look, I did something bad where it's like, what did I even do? Oh, no, oh yeah. We would actually just, it's because I wrapped in another object. We want to say return new item, right? So, but all that just to show that, you know, you can structure your code in a way that is easier to debug. Just with that simple refactor, I, you know, made it a little easier. I'm not going to leave the code like that because I find it a little confusing. But when we start talking about testing in a couple of weeks, that's something that you think about. Is like if you split stuff into a discrete method like that, rather than doing it all in one pass, it becomes easier to test. You get other benefits like that. Okay, could write one item. This would not work because the spread operator has to come before, just syntactically. I'm not sure if that's what you meant, but yeah, just putting the spread operator before works perfectly. I think, oh yeah, maybe you just meant this. You could do that. But since we're writing the function as toggle item, it's meant to work both ways, which is why we use the bang operator to toggle. How do you know what item? Yeah, that's what we just talked about. We could, yeah, we probably do want to do a 3. I guess it doesn't really matter in this case because that's more like the deep equals and shallow equals is when we're dealing with objects. And these are just simple variables. They're primitives, but it's just a number. But are we going to show you a better way to do this next week? It's a good question, Misty. In a way, although better is a loaded word, because in 2 weeks, what we're going to be learning is a much more complex way of doing things that is more production ready, I suppose, and more advanced. But I don't know if it's better. It's just, you know, more complex. We'll see when we get there if y'all think it's better or just annoying. In the future, we're going to get fed for Slack discussion. Yeah, we can, although it just depends. I really do like when I'm looking, I'm on 2 screens here, and it's helpful for me to just kind of see. It's helpful for me to kind of just see what's going on and have like a live feed. You can do a thread, but I think it's really helpful to just kind of keep things open and not worry too much about organization. Like I said, I want this to be more of a conversation if possible. So moving on, the next move is to do this app. So we want to start implementing this. We want to figure out this list form component. Let's check this out. Is basically, so there's kind of a sad face in there. This is an uncontrolled component. So I think y'all have worked with forms quite a bit recently. Correct me if I'm wrong. Oh, and that's exactly right, Noah. It's like better, but it's trickier, and a lot of people don't love Redux for that reason. So this is an uncontrolled component. We want to actually basically, if we think about the state of this component, this list form back to the UI is just this little zone right here. That's our list form, right? What, in the context of this little component, what is state? What would state mean? You know, like we talked about our application level state, which is the groceries, and we're updating stuff on that big array of groceries. But in this component level of just this list form, what do we want to store on state? Can you tell me that? This is going back to this point that I'm kind of adding to the curriculum here. This is an untraining kit, but I think it's important. We have our application level state, which is groceries, but we have our component level state. Yeah, Rob's getting there. That is definitely correct. Although that's kind of like looking at it from the other side. Or I guess that's how we're going to define it. I'm kind of asking more, even just before we get there, of like, what are we holding in? So yeah, I guess, I mean, that's completely right. We want to basically be able to type something in here and store it. So I would think more conceptually, before we even start implementing with the events, what we want to think about is just like, this is a form and we want to store the value of the form, right? So in this case, we're just implementing item name, and we want to just like store that. So let's kind of go through some of the same things here. This is again a class component. So we want to do a constructor, and let's just use this as a nice review to kind of go through this all again. It's going to be a pretty similar pattern. So all we're going to want to do is define a constructor here. And on that state, we're going to want to store like a new item. I might just call it item or something more general. So again, we're calling constructor because this is already defined. We don't have to make a new arrow function for it. And within this function, we are going to say super. And just as a note, what I just did so far, it's interesting to think about. This actually does nothing. If I just stopped here, and maybe that's why it's underlined. Yeah, see, useless constructor. Basically, with the way extends works, this is already there for you. Like, consider that code already written. And we're only kind of writing it again if we want to add stuff. So hopefully that makes sense of how that extends. It's kind of like creating a bunch of stuff for us already. We already have that kind of laid out for us. Now we're going to think about like what else we want to do with this component. So we call super, and then we say this dot state. This is where we're initializing state for this component. And all we're going to want here is a notion of like a new item, right? So whereas on the top level, we're storing like all of our groceries and we have all this stuff. In this case, all we have is a, sorry, wrong file. All we have is just an item. So I'm going to initialize this as just pretty much an empty string here, right? So that's our constructor. And so that's kind of the first step. And then you know, if you're thinking your CTR, we already have the render. And we're not really doing lifecycle methods yet, but we're just going to build our constructor, and now we actually want to handle changes. So this is where the interaction part comes in. So we want to think about these virtual events that are pretty much just the same as normal JavaScript events. They're set up to mirror them. And in this case, we wrote handle changes because there is the handler we're going to use is on change. And that's basically going to say that when this changes, like every keystroke individually is going to trigger something. So I'm going to start this with just a console log. Like, you know, just to see. It's helpful to kind of start with something like that. So, and then we want to call this from, let's see, where should we call this from? Can anyone tell me how I hook this up? I want that handle changes to be called every time I make a keystroke in this, you know, if I were to start typing something in every keystroke, I want to trigger that handle changes. How do I use that on change? It's going to be somewhere in this form input right here. So how do I hook this up? Yeah, that's exactly right. Nice. Cool. So, okay, that's good. It seems like y'all have seen this kind of thing recently, and this feels maybe a little more comfortable than like the spread operator stuff and some of what we just did. So I'll spend a little less time on this, but definitely, again, shout out questions, add questions to Slido. I want to make sure everyone's fully on board here. So we have our input, and notice there's no value yet. We don't even have a value. So get rid of that. So with our form, we want to, we're defining the input, right? Name is item, but it needs a value. Let's see, I'm gonna open this up again so we can kind of see what's going on. Oh, the linter's disagreeing. So I would, I should change my sandbox settings. So unchange is gonna be, let's see, also, yeah, this dot handle changes. And this is very important to note because in a function component, you wouldn't need to do that. But basically, this is saying that like what we're trying to bind is not within this render function. It's actually outside of it on this class, right? So this, in the sense of where we're at here, means this list form class. It just like zooms us out a level to say, okay, on the scope of this class, this dot handle changes, right? That's all we need. Pretty straightforward. So now let's see what happens. Every keystroke is calling that. And we can go a step further here and define the value. Can anyone tell me what the value of this should be? We want to now map this to state. What should the value of this form field be? That's right, but more specifically, I guess, it needs to come from state, and we're in a class component. That's right. Y'all are quick. Thank you. Stop state guide. Oh, now it opens it up. Love it. Okay, so now instead of just dumping out like this annoying message, what if I said, what would it be? E dot yeah, it's already going to be do this because we're already basically defining it on state. So if I wanted that to, oops, there is another step here that we have to do. We do have to actually set state. So first if we think of this as a two-way street of communication, value is saying that like if there was a predefined value in state, it's going to come in here. It's easy. Like I just forgot just now. I always I think a lot of people forget that this value defining here is not a two-way street. So this would work if we had defined like item is, that's going to show up there, right? Whereas that basically takes what's in state and we'll assign it to that field. But what we want to do is the other direction of communication, where what is coming from that field needs to be assigned. So that's where we're going to say, I think it's going to be e dot target dot value. Let's see if that works. I do this console log thing again, just because it's like, it's easy to write a lot of code and have some little typo or thing missing. If I'm logging and just doing one step at a time, I kind of know what's going on. So now, okay, that's interesting. So I'm seeing each stroke, but it's not coming through right. It's not saving it. So that's where we need to actually set state. So we'll go ahead and do the thing. This one's a little bit hard to debug as we go. So let's try it. So all we're gonna have to do is say this dot set state, and we're gonna say item is e dot target value. Let's see if that works now. There we go. too. Now we're looking good. So yeah, I will explain that one more time. There's a few aspects to this. I think the part that I know I get tripped up on, and I think it's probably the same for a lot of people, is just this idea that when we have a form, we have to build two ways of communication. And we see a lot of patterns like this in React that are going to be similar. But basically, like we have this on change that is going to map every keystroke to this function. And it's in here that we have to actually set state. We're using state in this component just to store this string, right? So we hook this up, and then if we were to not do this, basically then, I would just keep typing, and it would go into state, but it wouldn't be like coming back from state. So I guess you could do it without this, but the important part is that we're mapping and sending it into this function that is going to set state. And it's easy to just think that once you say value is this dot state dot item, that's going to work. But if you think of how the equals works in JavaScript, this is assigning that this dot state dot item value. Oh, sorry, it's annoying because we're calling it value, but it's assigning that value to this variable, right? It doesn't go the other way. This isn't like a two-way equals, basically. So that's the only tricky thing. So now that that's working, we're not going to need that. So the only thing we're missing here is we need to like submit it. So if you think about the steps of hooking up a form, we've now basically mapped what we type here to state. So like before I click add, this is already in state, but we actually have to submit it to this for this to be able to, somehow get into our application level state. What we want to do is not only just store like this string and just kind of hang out with that string on this subcomponent here on this list form. We want to actually send that apples string up to the top level in a way that it's going to be added to our application level state. Yeah, so yeah, that's exactly, we're going to have an on submit. I think I'll just go ahead and start implementing this, and then we'll find a little stopping point to take another quick break, and we can do questions and maybe do the clear after if there's time. But yeah, so if we started to build this out, what we're going to want to do is create like an on submit from the form itself. So we're going to have like an on submit here. I think you all have seen this before. Let me know if that's new to anyone. But we're going to do this on submit. This is again another React synthetic event, which is kind of built in the API. It's not, we don't have to import that from anywhere. It's just there for us as a handler. And we're going to call something here. Let's say submit, I'll say like add item. A good way to do it. Except the thing is, we can't exactly define that here. This is kind of seeing like the reverse of where we started. In order to manage our application level state, we actually are going to have to pass another prop down. And that's going to be our add item. Hopefully that makes sense. The way we pass down that prop of the from the top level being able to toggle an item, the way we pass that down to item, we also have to pass like an add item down so that from the list form we can add something. So we can't write this here. What we can write is a submit item. This is going to be just kind of like a simple class to call that that function from above. So I'll just kind of leave this here for now. This is going to be what we write. Maybe we'll do this after the break. But what we really need to do is figure out how to add an item. We're going to have to do that on the top level. So we're going to have to move back. So, but I'll just finish kind of the basics for this, which is just going to be, all we have to do is say this dot submit item. So we've now kind of like hooked things up in a basic way. But what needs to happen here is we're going to have to add the item. So let's go back up here and actually implement that. So I know this is a bit of a confusing architecture, and I know Mr. was asking like, is there a better way to do this? And yes, this is like why we start using Redux, because the prop drilling gets really gnarly if we're in like a big application. But you know, in a small thing like this is actually kind of a normal way to do it. It's not so bad. There's just a couple levels. So knowing how to do this is important. So we define toggle item here, and now we're just going to do another one to add an item. So does anyone have ideas for how we might do this, or any part that you feel like you know? Feel free to shout out in Slack. I'll just start writing this. But we're going to just basically make up another arrow function here. Here's kind of the same approach. We're just going to write like the shell of it. Just say we're going to take item here, and that's going to be coming through. We want to basically create like a new item. And we're just going to like build an item from what is coming through, right? If you think of what's coming from that form, it's just a string. So this is just a string that's going to be the name of that grocery item. So if we're just initializing a new grocery item, it's just going to be like, what's our default here? It's going to be something like this. So let's copy this format. So the name we're going to call item, because that's what we passed through, right? And here is a bit of a bigger conversation of how you assign an ID. Often that's going to happen on the database side. A simple way to just kind of create something that is reasonably unique is going to be date.now, because that's milliseconds, and unless you're creating you're like really fast typer and you're adding 2 grocery items to your list in the same millisecond, that's not going to happen. Here we don't really need to use the spread operator because we're like building something brand new. Like we don't have anything to spread out. You know what I mean? Like we can't really spread item because item actually isn't an object. It's just a string. So in this case, all we have to do is just build something new. But yeah, in a sense, we're doing a similar thing that when we do use the spread operator, we're creating something new rather than just editing what's there. And we're saying purchase false. So that's all going to work. And then, can anyone tell me like what the last step is for this function? We have to actually add that item to state. So how do we do that? Oh, nice built-in functions. Class component. Bruno's on a Redux. I mean, you know, you're not wrong. That is definitely a way to do that. But for now, we don't have to worry about any of that complexity. We're just going to say just that set state. Because if you think about it, I know Bruno probably has some experience with state management and is thinking of the idea of having like a store where instead of just like storing state on this component, there might be like an external source of state, right? But without that, like in lieu of that kind of complexity, all we have is just like, we've defined that this app component is the top level of our tree. And by definition, the state that is on this level is like our application level state. So hopefully that makes sense. That's kind of one of the ideas to think about, is that application level state is going to live at the top level, and then lower level is just like, you know, storing a string or something simple like that. It's a little more straightforward. So groceries is, now this is where we use the spread operator. Can anyone tell me what we do here? This is the last thing, and we can take a little break before we finish up. No, a little long this section. Yeah, okay, you guys got it. The spread operator is nothing to be afraid of. Just get used to using it everywhere. It's better than doing it with the old school JavaScript way without it. And then this, basically think of like we're creating an array here. Notice often we've used this within the context of a object, but we're actually creating an array here. And you can do the same thing. This is basically taking all the elements of the previous array, and we're going to also add another one, which is that new item. In this case, we're not overriding, we're actually just adding something new to what was there. So hope that all makes sense. Why don't we, let's take 5, and then I'm just going to hook that up, and we'll see it all working, and then we can do some final questions and see if y'all want to go over anything again. Thanks, y'all. right, y'all, come on back. Cool. So we'll finish this up. We go a couple minutes over tonight because we did intros and a lot of questions. I tend to try to err on the side of going long rather than rather than trying to rush through anything. So, and I'm always here to stick around for questions as long as anyone needs. A lot with the last class, we'd end up just doing some little mini Q&As after class pretty often, and I find that's just a helpful thing for whenever people have extra questions to really just kind of plug in and make sure all this stuff is sinking in. So if you have more questions, just feel free to load up Slido, and I'll stick around as long as we need, pretty much after every lecture. But yeah, for now, let's go in and finish this up. We're also going to do a similar thing that your instructors did in the last unit, figure out some open hours that we can kind of work through some stuff together and everyone gets to know each other. I think it'll be helpful as well, even though it's just me and not two instructors this time. So we've made this add item method here, and all we're gonna have to do now is just pass this down. So I know the prop drilling thing might still be a little confusing to some of you. So just to review kind of why we do that, it's this part of the UI is our list form component, and we want that component to be able to update the grocery list. We want to actually make changes to that state, which is, in a sense, application level state. It's state that lives on this app component. And if we were to have some more complex setup, we might use a state management tool. And the reason we make such an emphasis on like using the spread operator and being really orderly about how we update state is because as complexity grows, we need to know everything's happening in a very predictable way, right? So having created this add item, all we have to do is pass it down to our list form, which is actually right here. We don't have to pass this one through 2 levels. It's just 1 level because this is being rendered from the top. So we're just going to pass it down the same way. Add item is this, and if it's running class component, we have to go level up. This dot add item. Right, so we pass that down, and then the last step here is to go into our list form and just finish up this function, and then we'll be done. So all we're going to need to do is we need to actually like hook this up to call that add item function, right? So let's think on how we might do that. It's going to be pretty simple. First, so one thing to remember with forms, and this is kind of a biggie. Does anyone know what happens before I write this code, right? Before I've done this, what happens when I click add? What is like the default behavior in HTML of a form? Like, it doesn't even matter that we're using React. We have an HTML form here. What's going to happen when I click add? It refreshes and it sends all of the stuff as query params in the URL. We don't want to do that because in React, the whole idea is we never actually refresh. We simulate page movements, but we're in a single page app here. We're in a SPA, which means that, you know, we've delivered like a pretty hefty application to the browser. And if we have to like refresh and send the whole thing again, it's kind of like, it's just like pretty much like the worst thing that could happen. So we write this line in order to prevent that. So just whenever you're doing event handlers, kind of like the first thing you should think to do, especially when it comes to a form submit, is like, okay, I don't want to refresh the page. So I'm going to prevent default, and then let's think about what we're going to do. We're going to say we're going to call that add item function, and you know we haven't really like said anything here because it just kind of comes through. But when we call this, we're initializing our props. So we can just say this.props. So this is kind of just built in, ready for us because we passed it down. So now we have add item from the top level. And let's call it with this.state.item. A couple little other things I might have to add to this to get it fully working, but let's see if this works first. Yeah, there you go, it works. That's kind of all we need. The other things that we could also do is we want to like clear our state, right? We want to know that like when I click add, this is just kind of like a UX thing. We don't really want it's not logical for that to stay there. We want to actually clear the state. So this is kind of just like the first thing that we might want to do here is we're going to say we're going to set state to just like initializing again, right? So let's see about this. That's nice. So see how we kind of this way it's able to refresh like that, right? So to jump over to your project, it's really almost identical to this. And I think this, what we just did today, is going to be a great reference. You already have the, I wonder if maybe I shouldn't change the URL. Yeah, maybe it does. Well, I'll send this out again, just in case. I think if you open the old URL, it should redirect this way anyway. But here's this. So this is going to be your solution code here. And really just apply this to your project. It's going to be very similar. Here we are. What we have, yeah, that's kind of a stretch item that I'll add the code for that. We can go over it quickly, but it's kind of more of a optional one. So you will need to do that in the project. And that is really just like the same idea as what we did, but just using a filter, which is a different array method. I'll add that code. We could probably just take a minute and go through it real quick if everyone's down. But for your project, it's going to be a very simple thing. You have an array, and it's an array of objects, and each one is like a task. Task is very similar to a grocery. You know, it's kind of like a to-do is just more a general form of your grocery list. There's some more advanced stuff on here if you get to it, of like using local storage, but I don't think that's required. That's like a little more advanced. But as far as what you're going to do in the project, it's really just this toggling from false to true, where you're going to want to use that spread operator and the bang to toggle the Boolean value. It's going to be the same exact thing. And I think there's a filter on here too, I believe. Let's see. Yeah, exactly. So you have the clear completed. So let's go through that real quick. I know we're a couple minutes over here, but I think it'll be helpful. And then I'll just stick around for questions as long as people have them. So I'll just go through this briefly. For the clear, all we need to do, this is going to be in, I think it's in grocery list, right? Clear purchased. Yeah, exactly. So this one's already kind of partially hooked up for us. And we're just going to need to do a pretty similar thing. You notice that this is calling props.clearPurchased, just kind of assuming that's there. We actually don't have that, which I think, I'm surprised this doesn't cause an error. But yeah, so like, or maybe there's a skeleton of that. So yeah, no, there's not. So this is like in the top level, we are calling list form from here, right? We just need to actually pass down a clear purchase. So it's going to be the same thing as we just did. Or no, sorry, it's grocery list that we're doing it. That's right. So yeah, within grocery list, we actually have to send this down. So let's see. So right by toggle item, we're just going to do the same thing. We're going to pass down a clear purchase. This is pretty much just going to copy what we did before. Similar architecture here. And so let's just implement that real quick. So we have add item, we have toggle item, and now we're going to add clear purchase. So you already know I'm going to ask you, anyone that's clever with filter method, if anyone knows what code I should use for this. So start thinking about that and add any bits you have in Slack that will help us along. So clear purchase is going to be, saying this is just going to take, you can just take the event directly. This is kind of another way to do this. We just pass the event up. I don't know if any of y'all are knowing filters yet. So let's see. So we're gonna we can actually do this without a filter. An easy way to do it. Or no, we won't use filter. So passing this down, we're going to prevent default. And then we're going to set state. Somewhere we're just going to use filter. And we're going to take the previous one. Right, it's our previous state. And we're going to filter. And all we need to know is that per item, notice I was just thinking through this in my head, like we're just passing an event here and we don't actually need to pass any data because we're not adding something or like affecting a single one. We're just saying like, hey, clear purchase. There's no data to be sent from the lower level here. So for each item, we want to know that it's not purchased. Like this filter is saying keep all the ones where this is true. So it's saying keep the ones that aren't purchased, right? So now if we pass this down, I think I already sent this. So now all we have to do is within grocery list, I think we're done. That's it. So now if I cross these off and hit cleared purchased, yep, that's it. So that's all. I'll make sure to save this. I know that's a little quick, but it's pretty much the same. Like we've kind of done the same thing 3 times with passing these down. So it's a similar pattern and you're just going to do the same exact thing on your project. So you'll get some more practice with this. Just be thinking about the idea of application level state. That's the big thing here, and getting comfortable with the idea of, writing constructors and just the different ways of doing things for class components. Those are the big focus items for today. So let's see what questions y'all have. Feel free to add any more. I'll stick around as long as we need. So does this set state? We don't need to pass that down because that is actually from our React doc component. When we extend React doc component, we get that automatically. So that's something we would never. Oh, I see what you're saying though. So the binding this, yeah, see that gets a little tricky. We can't really do it like that. I guess like what you're asking with this question is, it's specifically, we're like by sending down the props, it's like the binding is kind of what we're doing. That's really the idea. So, when you think of the tree as these as separate elements, it's a little weird to think of the child being able to like call something from the parent. But you think of what's really going on here, it's all just like code that's kind of nested on a few levels. So it's just saying like, it's almost like just like drawing a reference of saying like, hey, like if you need to update state here, just like push this button, like you have access to this. It's basically granting access for them, for the child component to be able to adjust something on the parent, right? For the projects, the SLs might have a better, NTLs might have a better answer. I'm not exactly sure. Let's see. Basically, all I saw on my end was this to do. So hopefully that's the right one. Sometimes the links do get a little confused. I don't know if I closed this. But yeah, with the to-do project, it's like, this is what I have as your project. I think Sorting Hat was for the full-time classes, but I'm not exactly sure. So maybe a TL or SL could jump in with a better answer on that. I'm not exactly sure. Feel free to shout out any additional questions. Otherwise, we can call it a night. Hopefully that all made sense. And on Thursday, we're just going to be getting into the lifecycle methods and digging deeper into basically like how we do use effect. So if you think about it, we did use state tonight with class components, and on Thursday we're going to figure out how to do use effect. It's kind of like the two sides of managing state and side effects. So this is kind of your intro to class components. And this is all up to date. You can use this as a reference for your project. And hopefully that helps y'all. Have a great night, and I'll talk to you soon.